Madam Chair, the opposition bench in this debate has tried to foist the crudest possible conception of happiness that could ever exist on the whole government bench, and then use examples that purely reinforce that particular conception of happiness without engaging with the nuance that we had in our case. As we said very clearly at closing government, ladies and gentlemen, this debate isn't just about the number of people with an opinion on X, Y, and Z. It's about the extent to which that person's interest in being prejudiced, in being discriminatory, is more important than someone's core interest, ladies and gentlemen, in not suffering deprivation, in having a right to an education, in having a right not to be evicted from their black person community or whatever. We think that there are different interests which yield different forms of happiness, and a government can quantify those types of happiness in making their decisions. So to answer that question of whether rape could ever be acceptable, we think the happiness to the rapist of that rape could never outweigh the suffering to that woman and the immense bodily deprivation of being raped. We're happy to stand behind that principle. I can't believe I'm arguing in favour of rape. It's a good thing. Okay, so 3 questions at the end of the debate. Firstly, is utilitarianism self-defeating, engaging with the opposition's extension? Secondly, can the government adequately quantify and act on the basis of a happiness metric? And thirdly, which metric is best for protecting the interests of minorities? So is utilitarianism self-defeating? The first attack we got from the opposition is that we don't actually believe that happiness is intrinsic and unconditional, because we take into account actors such as animals, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, there's actually a pretty detailed philosophical debate about whether animals merit the same rights as humans. We reject the idea that if you're a utilitarian, you automatically need to elevate animals and their stake in happiness as meaning the same as humans. We have a much greater capacity to understand human happiness and human unhappiness and make policy decisions. But even if we're not being unconditionally consistent about happiness, ultimately governance is a pragmatic exercise. We're happy to prioritise the interests of the most important individuals from the government's perspective to protect, which is citizens and humans within their community. We think that's vastly preferable to the alternative. Somewhat unclear what that alternative was, but it's preferable. What we heard from the opposition further to this is, well, your plan means that you just count each person twice. You empower the most prejudiced people. That totally ignored our conception of happiness. Reject the idea that a racist prejudice, which means they want to discriminate against a black person, outweighs the importance of that black person of not being disenfranchised, of having the right to have opportunities, of having the right to make life choices. Those interests are vastly different, and quantifying them needs to be vastly different. That's why we never supported a numbers game, ladies and gentlemen. We were much more nuanced than that. The final point of their extension was the idea that, our plan ignores other conceptions of the human good. And in classic Oxford style, they pointed to this weird hypothetical of like a coma machine that can implant you with happiness, and that was actually all they said. Well, like, firstly, this machine doesn't exist. We're happy to operate in the real world, in team-closing government, and actually say when we don't have access to these types of mechanisms, ladies and gentlemen, that shouldn't be a consequence. But moreover, we are actually consistent on our side of the house with autonomy. We recognise the idea that individuals are in the best place to quantify their happiness. There's no reason why we need to support governments implanting happiness in individuals. We think governments should facilitate the greatest amount of happiness by providing a platform for that happiness. That's what I'm going to look at now in the second question. So can governments adequately quantify and act on happiness? I'll take Derek. Yeah.
Make up your mind. On one hand, you're saying, well, we want to be able to take into account happiness, but prioritise it where it's important. How is that not the status quo, and how is that consistent with what you're trying to motivate?
We have made up our mind. The issue is how you actually measure happiness and whose interests are affected. We think there's a higher stake in happiness for particular actors, and certain interests are more important to happiness than other interests. As I said, the interest in prejudice is not necessarily more important to happiness than the interest in not being persecuted. It's pretty bloody simple. Okay, can governments adequately quantify happiness? We accept that individual happiness is difficult to quantify, but we think there are objective indicia that enable governments to tailor policy towards that. We pointed to the UN Global Happiness Index, which looks at factors like access to healthcare, infant mortality, access to education. Oxford, in their brilliance, said, well, what is that? That's ridiculous. Let's just scoff at it, it'll go away. Let me explain why happiness is quantified through these measures. because these are the measures which affect the ability to actualize potential and actualize your happiness. If you don't have access to healthcare, your life prospects are vastly diminished. You're not able to exercise yourself to go out into society to live a happy life. If you don't have education, the amount of opportunities you have are so highly constrained that you lack any capacity to actually improve yourself and actually pull yourself out of poverty. Simply scoffing at that ignores the objective benefits of these indicators. We think government should tailor its policy in this way. No. Moreover, relying on happiness doesn't necessitate short-term policy. We think long-term environmental policy, for example, is much better safeguarded through our case. Why is that? There's no necessary automatic economic benefit to safeguarding the environment. There's no necessary majority in favour of safeguarding the environment. But if you approach it from the perspective of happiness, that allows broader factors, like the inherent worth of the environment, like the happiness generated to people by having the environment. It's inherent because it's true. Happiness, ladies and gentlemen, is something that impacts people in terms of their sense of worth, the nature of the community, the way they feel living in that society. Government should factor that in. We think that's much more likely under our plan, rather than the majoritarian approach, where apparently people will always act in their own self-interest, not commit resources, not commit taxes to actually saving these kind of long-term interests. No. Let's look at the implication for minorities. What we heard from Anat is that we can't play the numbers game. We need to consider other metrics. We didn't know exactly what those metrics were. We think the actual metric you need to consider is happiness. We thought it was pretty weird the opening opposition was concerned with doing what the majority wants, yet claimed their plan helped disadvantaged groups, with never any analysis of why their plan was more likely to actually help the interest of these kinds of groups. We reject the notion that the state is obliged to be purely majoritarian. We think the state has a protective role to protect those actors with the highest impact, ladies and gentlemen. We think if you support the exact same thing, ladies and gentlemen, then happiness is intrinsic to that, because it's saying that the minority stake in that particular value is so important that it outweighs the benefits to other people from having those rights overturned. Moreover, ladies and gentlemen, we never supported a crude, numbers-based calculus, ladies and gentlemen. We think we need to consider the extent of the interest affected. And what that refers to is the difference between core and peripheral interests. We think there are core interests in a right to healthcare, in redistributive tax system, ladies and gentlemen, in not being discriminated against, as opposed to the peripheral interest in being able to overturn the views of minorities. So ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, we are having our cake. We are eating it too, and it's delicious. Because that's the way government policy should be formed, recognising that happiness is both quantifiable and measurably better as a form of policy. That's why we propose.